Good afternoon, Write the Docs Prague 2019. Thank you very much for having me here at the conference today. My name's Brian Lemke, and today I'm going to tell you the story of how I launched startups with good docs. Let's start by describing the situation that I've encountered when hired as a technical writer at a software startup in Berlin. So generally, the company's already kind of got things going. They've assembled a nice team of software developers, QA, designers, marketing. And so they've got the team together. The team has already started building the product. Things are going underway. Things are going pretty well. And they've already set a date for the release of the minimum viable product, or MVP. But there's a slight problem, something that's been nagging in the backs of their minds, perhaps for a sprint or two, something that they know is a problem, and perhaps they've been putting it off until a time when all the other important things are done. But the fact of the matter is, they haven't started on the documentation. And it's a problem. I mean, the release is 1 month away, and there's no docs. What are we supposed to do? So I have entered this situation a number of times in the past. I have launched the docs at a couple of tech startups in Berlin. For example, my current employer, Humanitech, the docs for an internal development platform for modern applications. I have also launched the docs at Relayer, an industrial IoT device and edge management platform, and at Telefonica Next for a consumer IoT platform. So in my talk today, I'm going to start by describing the characters that you, as a documentarian, need to work with very closely in the beginning in order to make these good documentation happen. I will talk about how to get a good process and plan together that works for everyone, because the sooner you make documentation everyone's business, the more likely you are to succeed with the launch. And once you've got this plan and this process together, I'll talk about how I actually executed it by creating a docs as code setup. And at the very end, we do need to discuss some challenges and obstacles that you may encounter in your journey to launch your startup with good docs. So we'll start with the characters. There is the startup developer, highly innovative, up to date on all the latest technologies, forward-thinking, likes to think outside the box, think around corners. They joined the startup because they are tired of bureaucratic processes telling them that they can't do things the way they think they could be done best, or however they would prefer. So they joined a startup because they want to build something new that never existed before, and they want to do so free from hassle. Now, unfortunately, historically speaking, one of these hassles for them has been writing documentation. Now, it's not a hassle for them because they're actually opposed to writing documentation. Every single developer wants good documentation. It's just that, in the past, their experiences at these large software organizations have had documentation processes that did not fit their workflow or make things easy for them. And another thing you have to realize about the startup developer is that a lot of them do come straight from school. And so much of their documentation experience is documenting the code for the professor, for the grade. However, they don't have the practical experience of working in a team with or without a technical writer and a documentation process. Now, in every story, you need to understand the motivations of the character, because the motivation helps you understand really who this character is and how to work with them. The startup developer's motivation is to focus on shipping the code, and they want the documentation to be easy, and they want someone to tell them how to do it. They want to focus on the code. They don't want to take the time to come together, have a meeting on how are we supposed to do our documentation, what tools are we supposed to use. They would much rather be told, but they want it to be easy and accessible. Then there's also the startup product person. So the product person is the creative thinker behind the entire operation. They know absolutely everything about their industry segment, including which products have the best documentation. Now, the product person generally does have some documentation experience themselves, because in startup world, the saying goes you have to wear many different hats, not necessarily the one that you signed up for in your role at the company. And the documentation hat, which tends to be one of the least popular hats in the startup, often lands on the product person. Sadly, it often lands on the product person a little bit late into the process, and so without the time to research the tools or the processes to create a full-blown documentation system, they often have to bring something together in Google Docs or Confluence for the launch. And there's nothing wrong with those tools in themselves. It's just that your users, when you launch the product, are going to expect something more. Now, the product person's motivation, apart from their product having the best documentation in their industry segment, their motivation is they need the good documentation so that they can communicate more effectively with the other stakeholders in the organization, including marketing, the founders, and support. So they need this documentation in order to coordinate all of the stakeholders around the product launch so that what the product does and what benefits it can bring are effectively communicated to the outside based on what it does. And so they want to find a way to get the developers to write and contribute to the documentation in a way that works for them and is easy, because the product person knows that if they try to get the developers to contribute Google Docs or something on a WordPress site, they are going to be met with resistance. Now, there are plenty of other characters you need to work with in the startup, such as marketing and support, but these two are the crucial ones that you need to forge your alliance with at the very beginning, because these two are crucial to building a documentation system that works for everyone. You have to build a system that works for everyone because documentation is everyone's business. You are not a documentation silo as a documentarian. Everyone has to do their part, even at the very beginning when the product has yet to be launched. So, how do you build a system that works for everyone? Let's discuss. So, the first principle that you need to impart on the startup, and I understand that time is short and people are stressed because the launch is coming up, but everyone has to understand that documentation is a part of the product and not a byproduct of the code. It is not merely a script that the developers can run a week before release and then put in a shared drive somewhere to send to the customers. It has to be considered a part of your product, and as part of your product, it needs to be one of the core features. Now, documentation is a special feature because it draws upon all of the other features of the product. However, it still needs to be considered its own feature rather than a subcomponent of every feature. Now, in order to integrate it into your product as a feature, it's good to add it to your product roadmap. At Humanitech, we have our roadmap up on the wall as a series of great white sheets of paper with each feature listed as a swim lane. And when I showed up at Humanitech on my first day, I had my very own documentation swim lane with nothing in it but my picture next to it. Little intimidating, but it was the right idea. So when you put it on the roadmap, it becomes recognizable within the organization that it needs to go out with the launch and it needs special attention of its own. Now, within your roadmap, so you've got your short-term roadmap for the product launch, but you need to make sure that you have a specific set of deliverables up to the launch. And again, this is a very short timeline. I know I'm being awfully demanding here, but you do have to implement this at the very beginning. Because this is a good time to check in with your product person. Because even though you have the launch date set, perhaps you have an early access customer whom you're trying to turn into one of your power users or a great case study, and so they've requested some preliminary documentation ahead of your launch so that they can tell what they're getting themselves into. And in an agile or Kanban environment, it's all about iterative delivery of the product. And so you have to consider this with the documentation as well. Check in with your product person to see what needs to be delivered when. For example, Humanitech, we knew that our most important feature was the core API documentation gateway, so we needed to have that documentation sorted first. And then at the end of Q1, we needed to have the entire system up and running. So documentation's on your roadmap. You've defined a set of milestones for what needs to be delivered when. Now let's talk about more specifically how to get the actual work done. I believe that in an agile Kanban environment, the best way to create documentation tasks is to create them as user stories within feature epics. I don't like to create a documentation epic of its own, even though it is its own feature, because then that creates a disconnect between your product features and the documentation itself. Furthermore, when you create the stories in the documentation epics, that creates a mandatory step to write the documentation before the feature can be considered done. Now, even though as a user story, these stories do tend to fall into the backlog when a million other requirements come up, as often happens in startups, the fact that they are listed within the feature epic means that you can fight to prioritize them as part of the development process. Now, I like to do my user stories by creating one user story per documentation artifact. As an example, at Humanitech, originally we had planned a marketplace of open source microservices. And each of these microservices had a specific set of documentation artifacts, such as a Markdown README file and Swagger documentation. So per microservice, I created a user story within that microservice's feature epic for those documentation artifacts. Now let's talk about how to actually execute this plan. I prefer to implement documentation systems as docs as code. Now, can I see a quick show of hands? How many of you are familiar with the term docs as code? Okay, so almost everyone, but for those who aren't, I pulled the definition from the Write the Docs website because I felt that it summed it up very well. Documentation as code refers to a philosophy that you should be writing documentation with the same tools as code, and this includes version control, automated testing, issue tracking, etc. And the reason why I prefer to do this at a startup is because, first of all, it saves time and money, and it lets the developers drive the documentation. With Docs as code setups, there are many free and open source tools out there, which for a startup obviously impacts your bottom line very well. And you can also integrate them with the tools that you've already paid for. And when you implement a Docs as code setup, it gives your developers a sense of ownership of the process, because you use tools that are tailored to their workflows, to their day-to-day. And so that gives them a sense that the process works well for them. Now, there has been some very good talks at past Write the Docs conferences about how to implement a Docs as code system, and I'll mention those at the very end of the presentation. What I'm going to talk about today is what I did and why I felt that that was effective for the startup at the very beginning in order to get the product launched. So I'll talk about what I did for Humanitech. Now, as I mentioned before, we had planned a marketplace of open source microservices, and each of these microservices had a set of documentation artifacts. Now, these documentation artifacts were stored in the GitHub repositories where the code was being written. And it needed to be maintained in there because the developers who were using microservices from the marketplace would expect to see the documentation in the repository. However, we also needed a centralized location where all of the documentation would be displayed as a single cohesive resource. So the challenge was how to maintain them in two different locations. So what we decided was our developers will maintain the documentation in the repositories where the code lives. And then we would create a continuous integration pipeline that would send all of the documentation into a centralized docs site repository, where it would then be served by the static site generator Hugo. And this worked for our developers because in their regular workflow, they could just take on the documentation tasks, write the documentation in tools that they're familiar with, languages that they're familiar with. They don't need to go to any third-party tools whatsoever. And whenever they push a code update, the continuous integration pipeline creates a documentation update, and it gets stored in the central site. Now, I chose Hugo as the static site generator because Hugo also includes support for rendered HTML contents, because obviously Swagger.json and rendered HTML are not Markdown, and Hugo generally only renders markdown contents. However, if you put these contents in the static directory, then you can also have them served up with the site using a consistent URL structure, which your marketing people will definitely appreciate. And it creates a singular look and feel, all while being stored in the same location. And because our platform runs on Kubernetes, the Hugo site is then run on a Docker container in our Kubernetes infrastructure. So all of it is integrated end-to-end, from the developers writing the code all the way to the documentation being updated on the site. So that's a simple overview of the system that I've created at Humanitech. But we also have to talk about some obstacles that you may encounter in the process of developing your documentation. When you create the process that works for the developers, it's very easy to get everyone's buy-in because they all agree that it's a good idea and that it works for them. However, in the startup world, there are many competing priorities. Generally, you're working with a smaller team, and so everyone has to take on extra work on a regular basis. And so it can be a struggle to fight to keep documentation prioritized for the launch. But it's crucial that you do so, because this is what your users and also your investors are going to ask for first. And so it has to be maintained as a priority for the initial launch. There is, however, one almost uniquely startup problem that I'd like to discuss with you all. And it is something that happens frequently in startups, and when I was less experienced, it did feel like the end of the world, but it is manageable. I am, of course, referring to the pivot. The pivot can strike out of nowhere. Your initial assumptions failed. Your user tests didn't go so well. Turns out there was no market for your initial idea, or maybe the investors came along one day and said, this has got to be on the blockchain. Don't ask questions, just do it. No matter what the case may be with the pivot, it is very easy to overcome. Don't panic, and don't lose hope. Because if you implement a system like the one I've described today, this system will not change with a pivot. A good documentation system will make it easier for you to pivot, because no matter how the contents of the documentation may change, maybe you have to write everything over again, the important thing is you've got the developers on board, you've got them set up with tools that they're used to and that they can use. You've got an entire automated update system so that the code will update the documentation itself. All you have to do is sit together again with your product person and figure out what sorts of new contents have to emerge. So I'll wrap up with some key takeaways from this talk. The first is that documentation is everyone's business. Make docs a part of the product at the very beginning. Choose a process and tools that work for everyone, because as a startup, you don't have time to spend time onboarding everyone onto a brand new tool, and these things tend to cost money, which maybe you don't have. Maybe you'd rather keep the lights on. So choose a process and tools that work for everyone. And remember that a good documentation system makes it easier to pivot. So what can you do now? First thing you can do, if the documentation is not on the roadmap, get it on there. Maybe the documentation hat has been bouncing around the organization from some time. Tell somebody to wear it or put it on yourself. Ask the developers for advice on what tools would make it easier for them to contribute to the documentation. Usually they're free and they're always willing to teach you. And make a process and run it by the developers. Get them to buy in so that you don't encounter any resistance. And perhaps maybe you're not comfortable with the Docs as Code toolset. Perhaps you're not comfortable with Git. Perhaps you're not used to continuous integration. The good news is your developers are, and they would love to teach you. So leverage that, let them be the expert, and then leverage that to build your documentation system. Some previous talks on Docs as Code, which you should definitely check out. There's Treating Documentation Like Code, a Practical Account by Jody Petrino. And there's also Bootstrapping Docs at a Startup by Jesse Seldes. Thank you for listening. It's been a pleasure, and enjoy the rest of your day.